Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with my July wrap up. And before we really get into my July wrap up, I just kind of wanted to do a bit of a channel update for you. I am planning on taking a break from filming and uploading for at least a couple of weeks, just because I feel like my creative juices are down. I don't really feel like I'm coming up with a lot of great video ideas, so I feel like I need to kind of get back into just reading what I want to read and not trying to structure anything, not trying to keep up with read-alongs or buddy reads or anything like that. I just want to take kind of a mental break and also a digital break. So you may have noticed that I'm taking a long time getting back to comments, and I really do apologize for that. And I do intend to reply to every single comment. It just takes me a while to do it, and it's very rarely on the day that the video gets posted that I'm able to reply to comments. So during this break, maybe I will just heart comments, and I do read everything. I just sometimes don't have the chance to respond at that moment. So maybe I will just heart some things for the time being if I don't have the chance to respond, since I kind of want to do a bit of a digital detox at the same time as this break. I think it will do me some good to step away for a little while. And I think honestly that probably something that might come out of this is that when I come back from my break, that I'm probably just going to upload when I can and not try to marry myself to a specific schedule. I have really liked doing that. I really like uploading on Monday and Friday, but I kind of think that maybe it would be less stress on me if I just decided to film, edit, and upload on any given day and not feel married to making sure that I have 2 videos up each week. I'm looking forward to taking a break to kind of get my creativity back going, because I do feel like I really need some new and innovative video ideas, and I think taking a break will help me with that. If you have any thoughts on video ideas, I would love to hear them down below, but I just wanted to inform you so that you didn't wonder where on earth I went. But let's just get into the books that I read this July. Of course, July was Jane Austen July, and I really tried to participate pretty heavily in that this year, and I really did. I would say that that was a success, but some of the things that I read for Jane Austen July were not a hit. Some things were, so maybe let's start with Jane Austen July things first. The main event of Jane Austen July was, of course, to read a work by Jane Austen. So I reread Mansfield Park this month, and I buddy read it with Svea, whose channel I will link to down below. And Svea had never read this before, but it was my second time through, and I was really shocked at the amount of things that I had forgotten. And it was really fun to read it with somebody who was just exploring this book for the first time, because it did make it a really enjoyable reread experience. I don't think Svea fell head over heels in love with it the way that I did the first time that I read it, but it's interesting because the first time I read Mansfield Park, I did not know what was coming, and I didn't know who the love interest was. And so this time, that kind of fun, not knowing what was going to happen, that was really sucked out of the experience, and so I had to make do with the fact that I actually knew where the book was going to wind up. And overall, I think that made me enjoy the book a little bit better. It made me feel like I actually liked it even more on a second read. Mansfield Park is a book that a lot of people seem to struggle with, and a lot of Jane Austen fans in particular seem to struggle with, but it's always been the one book of hers that I felt really personally connected to. So I'm really glad to say that on reread, I still felt the same way about it. I still really, really loved the reading experience. My main goal with Jane Austen July this year was to really immerse myself in the time period, and so I really focused on mainly reading books that Jane Austen potentially could have read or were influences on her. And so one of the books that I really wanted to read that's been high on my TBR for a long time and has particularly shown up on Jane Austen July TBRs in the past was Evelina by Frances Burney. And I finally read that this month. This was just okay. This was a little bit of a letdown to me. This is an epistolary novel, and it didn't need to be. There were a couple of instances where having someone else's perspective was really nice, where you really wanted somebody else's perspective, that made reading the letters really fun and engaging. But for the most part, this book is told from Evelina's perspective, so it kind of leads me to believe that there was really no point in making it an epistolary novel. This was written much earlier than Jane Austen's works, and it's from the later 1700s, and it's so funny. Libby Stevenson, who is an amazing booktuber, posted a video last week, I believe, all about Georgian and Regency classics, and I will link to that down below because it was really fascinating. I love to hear her perspective on everything, but she made a pretty good point about classics of this era, that they tend to fall into certain genres. So Evelina and Jane Austen's novels actually kind of fall into the plot called the marriage game. And her point in that video is that really once you've read one marriage game novel, you have read them all. I have found that to be very true, and she kind of clarified to me what some of my issues with Evelina were when I watched that video. But I also attempted to read this month and DNF'd Belinda by Mariah Edgeworth, and we will get there because that's a really interesting one. But I have found since kind of moving on with my reading, after finishing Mansfield Park, Evelina, attempting Belinda, the events of the books are starting to blur together to me. So I certainly believe that Libby has a point when she says that certain plot points will pop up in every book in that genre. And she kind of showed how that goes for the marriage game novel, how it goes for the Gothic novel. And on the one hand, I really wanted to disagree with her because I tend to really like Gothic novels that were written at this time period. But when I really thought about it, I thought, yes, they are very repetitive. Most books written at this time are very episodic, and so it almost feels like you could take one chapter out of the middle and place it towards the beginning, and that would have no bearing on the plot. It would change nothing because everything feels very, very episodic in nature, and that's just, I think, the nature of writing during this period of time. But it means that really, once you have read one book in each of these genres, you might have just read them all. You kind of got the gist of the genre. So apparently, I just really like the Gothic genre, and I don't mind the fact that I'm reading the same plot points or plot twists over and over, that the characters essentially feel the same in every book, because I really get on with that setup. The marriage game book must be a much harder sell for me because Evelina fell quite flat for me in some places. In other places, it was really quite fun. But now looking back, I can't really differentiate what I read in Evelina versus parts of what I read in Mansfield Park versus part of what I read in Belinda. So I possibly made a mistake here trying to read a bunch of books that were written at the same time, because it does feel as though I read the same story multiple different ways. And had they all been Gothic novels, maybe I wouldn't have complained about that. But because they were, for the most part, this kind of marriage game setup, things did start to blur together a little bit for me. So ultimately, I gave Evelina 3 stars, I think. And it's enjoyable. I think I would recommend it, but I don't really know that it's one that I will ever return to. And it's not one that inspired a whole bunch of emotions in me. It just felt very run-of-the-mill. So I did DNF Belinda by Mariah Edgeworth, and this is through no fault of the books, because this month wound up being a very audiobook-heavy month for me. Audiobooks were my best friend, and so I was attempting to listen to the LibriVox recording of this book, and if you have ever tried to read a full LibriVox recording, if you have ever tried to listen to a full LibriVox recording of a classic, and you've done it, if you've somehow done it successfully, wow. I applaud you, because this one was really brutal. It changed narrators so many times, and then it eventually changed to a narrator that I could not listen to. Their voice just really grated on me. And so I got to, I think, about the 200-page mark, and I had to give it up. But I definitely will return to this one, and I will read this physically. This was absolutely fascinating. I was so engaged with this when I was listening to the earlier chapters. I really thought that I was going to wind up loving this, and I still have that feeling. So this is one that I definitely foresee myself returning to. I DNF'd it, not because I thought the book was bad, but sometimes I get like that with audiobook narrators. There are some audiobook narrators that I just cannot listen to, and I got to that point with this book. But this does kind of fall under the marriage game umbrella, so to speak, but I think it was making a lot of interesting social commentary. There was a lot in here about race and interracial marriage. There is an interracial marriage in this book, and it's so interesting how the book approached it. And there's also this really interesting conversation around gender happening in this book. At one point, a woman says that she fought a duel with another woman, but the reason that they got in trouble was because they wore men's clothing to fight the duel. And she thinks there would have been no problem with them fighting a duel at all had they done it in petticoats. So I found it to be a really thought-provoking and forward-thinking novel for the time period in which it was written. So this is one that I am definitely going to return to. This is not a permanent DNF. Something that is a permanent DNF is a book that I kind of forgot to talk about when talking about marriage game novels, because this book is actually called Marriage, and it's by Susan Ferrier, who is sometimes talked about as being the Jane Austen of Scotland. And I see why. I think the writing was very, very similar, but the characters here are so brutal. You just hate the people in this book, and they don't even feel very fully formed as characters, interestingly enough. They feel very much like archetypes, so you don't really feel all that invested in what is going on with the characters. And then, if you're trying to be invested in the plot, there's not much of one. So I just decided to give up on this one about halfway through. This was my first book that I tried to pick up for Jane Austen July. And I am starting to tell myself to be a little bit more free with DNFing, because there are so many books in the world that I really actively want to read. There is no need to waste my time with something that is just okay, or that I'm just not feeling. And it's okay to say that I am permanently DNFing something. Not everything is mood-based, though for me, a lot of the time it is. Not everything is, I'm not in the mood to read this right now. Sometimes you just don't like a book, and it's okay to admit that. And I don't think that I was going to like Marriage. I got halfway through, so I feel like I got a good bit of the way through before I called it quits. But this is one that is a permanent DNF. I also read a lot of poetry for Jane Austen July, but I didn't really know how to talk about it, so maybe I will do a separate video on that. That's kind of a recent poetry wrap-up. And I should have mentioned at the beginning that I did read a lot of kind of Greek myth retellings this month. I read a lot this month. In terms of quantity, I read quite a bit. In terms of quality, that's a little bit more questionable, but I did read a lot of myth retellings this month, and I did an entirely separate video wrap-up on those, so I will link to that down below. But moving on from things that I read for Jane Austen July, I also read A Declaration of the Rights of Magicians by H.G. Parry. This is a historical fantasy that is set during the French Revolution, and it follows a lot of key historical figures from the time period. So like Robespierre, William Pitt in England. This is one that I had a lot of problems with, because I really do struggle with historical fantasy that is about actual historical figures. Now, I do tend to really like historical fantasy, and in fact, I would tell you historical fantasy is actually my favorite genre, because I really love when fantasy interacts with the real world, but this is such a weird one. It's really difficult for me with actual historical figures, because I'm just going to take one person for an example here. Let's take Robespierre. So in this book, Robespierre is something called a mesmer. So basically, when he speaks, he can kind of turn on his mesmerism, and you're persuaded to do exactly what he wanted you to do. Now, I'm going to tell you my issue with this. Robespierre is a really important figure in the French Revolution because he was a big talker. He is somebody that for some odd reason people listened to. And I can see why the author chose to go with something like mesmerism here, because really, why was Robespierre the person that people decided to listen to? Robespierre basically came out of nowhere in the French Revolution, and people just really responded to him at the Estates General. But something that I think is really fascinating about Robespierre Robespierre, and that's really fascinating about a lot of figures in the French Revolution, is that they could have been anyone. Robespierre's position could have been occupied, seemingly, it could have been occupied by any other French lawyer. So really, why was it Robespierre? It's one of those really interesting moments in time where an ordinary man enters history. That's something that happens with Robespierre, and you could say this for quite a few figures in the French Revolution, actually. Several of them were big names prior to the French Revolution, but Robespierre kind of was not. So he's really the example I wanted to go with. A book like this makes you think that Robespierre couldn't have done it on his own. It makes you think, oh, magic had to be involved. And that's something that I really have a problem with. This book really wanted to comment on not only the French Revolution and the social politics there, but it really also wanted to comment on the slave trade, and specifically things that were going on in the Caribbean during this time period. Slave revolts, slave uprisings, and that was all chalked up to magic as well. I just found that disingenuous, and I almost found it tacky, if you want to know the truth, because I just think in serious situations like that, it just felt weird. It feels weird to inject magic into truly important political moments in history, or truly important historical events anyway, where it kind of makes you feel like, well, this couldn't possibly have happened if they didn't have magic. And maybe I am looking at this the wrong way. You know, maybe she chose to put magic in this time period because she thought, wow, it's incredible that ordinary people were able to achieve these things, were able to make these changes for good or for bad. And so maybe she was doing it kind of as an honoring thing, honoring the fact that ordinary people did things like this. And so it's just a weird book. At times it's weirdly boring. At times it moves too fast. I say all this to say that this series is a duology, and the next book is about Napoleon. And Napoleon is apparently a war magician. And some part of me just can't ignore the pull to that. Like, some part of me just really, really wants to read that, despite the fact that I had so many problems here. And so maybe I will. Maybe I will read that. But this was just a weird one, and I would love to know down below how you feel about historical fantasy that uses actual historical figures. I also listened to the Kreutzer Sonata by Tolstoy this month. And I know you're wondering about this because I'm also wondering. I have read a lot of Tolstoy for him to be an author that I have come to the conclusion that I don't like. And so this is the fourth thing that I have attempted by Tolstoy. But it might be the thing that I have enjoyed the most by him. This is a really interesting novella, and I am finding through reading a whole bunch of Russian literature that short fiction in Russian literature works so well for me. This is essentially about a man who killed his wife, and he is explaining it to a guy on the train. Basically, here's how I got to this point. Here's how I did this. And I thought this was so fascinating. I loved the way that it looked at the relationship between this man and his wife. And it was so interesting how he was kind of, moved to kill her for something that she did, but she would never have done it had he been a good husband. And so it was a really interesting look into marriage, into women's roles. And so this was another really thought-provoking read. But it is one that I have kind of forgotten about since I read it, and I think it's because I listened to it. So this is one that I'll probably reread one day, but it's really encouraged me to move on to the death of Ivan Ilyich. So that's one that I am really looking forward to, because a lot of people have told me that even though I've struggled with Tolstoy's longer works, I will probably love that. So that's one that I'm really excited about, but that was the Kretzer Sonata. I also listened to The Red Prince by Helen Carr, and this is a nonfiction work that is about John of Gaunt. This is a big release in the nonfiction world, the history nonfiction world this year, and this is one that I have heard endless hype about. There are certain books that have come out this year in kind of the history nonfiction realm that I have heard so much hype about. One of them is about the White Ship that went down in the 1100s, and I'm really interested to listen to that. And another of them is Mark Morris's apparently excellent book on the Anglo-Saxon period of England. But then I've also heard so much about Helen Carr's Red Prince. People are just talking about this left, right, and center. And I fell victim to hype here. I think that had I just went into this curious about John of Gaunt, I would have enjoyed it more. As it was basically a 3-star read. But if you don't know who John of Gaunt is, he is one of the many children of Edward III, who was a really long-lived king of England in the medieval period. And John of Gaunt was very close with Chaucer. He's a really interesting figure who we should probably be giving a little bit more attention to. There were a lot of children of Edward III, all of them very important because all of their lines went on to kind of form the newer royal lines in terms of England's royal family. And so they are the basis for the Wars of the Roses. John of Gaunt is a really interesting one that we think of mostly for his influence on the Wars of the Roses, marriages that he made, children that he had. But attention is very rarely paid to him personally. And so that was Helen Carr's view with this book, was to really shine a light on John of Gaunt. And this is a fascinating period in history. We're getting into the 100 Years' War with France. John of Gaunt is surrounded by a lot of really interesting people. Chaucer, like I mentioned, his elder brother, Edward, the Black Prince, of course, his father, his mother, really interesting people were living at this time. And all of them are sadly more interesting than John of Gaunt. I'm sad to say, because John of Gaunt should have been the main character of this nonfiction. This book should have been John's story. But I think there must not be very much of him in the historical record. So Helen Carr was forced to kind of say Edward the Black Prince was in Calais, so we can assume John was with him. But this is what Edward was doing while he was in Calais. And so it became a big thing where you were essentially reading about all of the people that surrounded John, and you weren't really reading about John, which was kind of sad. But it is a very easy to read nonfiction, and it's one that I would highly recommend if you are a fan of this time period, because I just think it's fascinating, and I love this time period. It's very, full of jousting and knights, and John of Gaunt jousted, and he was a big player in the tournaments, and so you get to hear a little bit about that. He was also a big reader, and he was a bit of a patron of the arts, and one of my favorite places to visit is medieval London. I really love to experience medieval London. I love to go back in time and read any kind of book about medieval London. It just feels like an old friend to me. So it was kind of nice to visit medieval London through this book, but I just didn't feel like there was enough of John of Gaunt in it, which was a strange thing to say because it was meant to be kind of the first full biography of him. So this is one that I fell into the hype with, and I think plenty of other people have as well, but I would be interested to see what else comes from Helen Carr, because I did think this was very well researched, and it was also very easily digestible. It's good narrative history, which I know a lot of people really like, and so I can see why this took off, but I just felt as though for it to be kind of a special piece on this particular figure didn't really get to shine. But that was The Red Prince. I think that I gave that 3 stars. I also read When Women Ruled the World by Cooney, and this was absolutely fantastic. This is a nonfiction book about 6 queens of Egypt, and it is so good. It is so fantastic. I only rated this 4 stars because she did something that really irritates me. And it is something that is very popular nowadays in historical nonfiction to do, but it is something that I have personally always had qualms with. And it's that she injects so much of the modern day into this book. She will talk about hardships that these women may have faced, and then she will link it to Angela Merkel or Hillary Clinton having to wear a pantsuit and dull down their femininity to be taken seriously by men. And definitely there's a point there. There's a point in all of these allusions that she makes to the 2016 election, to things that happened with Margaret Thatcher. There's definitely a point to it in that we still treat women in power in a very similar way. But the interesting thing is the Egyptians did not treat women in power that way. And I think that probably should have been more of the focus of the book. Not necessarily that ancient Egypt was a feminist society, but that they understood the need for women to step into roles of power. But at any rate, that is a pet peeve of mine. And I don't necessarily think she was pushing a political agenda here, because she really was trying to say the way that we have treated women in power hasn't really changed. Women are forced to kind of masculinize themselves. They are forced to kind of be serious and never show the fact that they've been in a relationship with anybody, because that shows weakness, or it shows that they are emotional. And she does show that there are examples of that in these women's lives. So she shows 6 pharaohs of Egypt who were women. And so they go back really, really far in time. So the first couple of queens that she talks about are so far back in time that she almost doesn't have very much to say about them, because there's not much that can be known for sure. But the last queen that she speaks of is, of course, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last queen of Egypt. And so she has quite a bit to say on Cleopatra. But I tabbed this up. I did tab all of the modern allusions that she was making. Those are green. But the pink are where I learned something. It was a fact that I really wanted to make note of. I thought this was fascinating. I used to really, really be obsessed with ancient Egypt, and this book reminded me why. It is such a fascinating culture. It is such a fascinating ancient civilization, and she covers, in these 6 queens, she covers thousands of years. And things change so much over those thousands of years that the Egypt that Cleopatra is ruling over is, of course, nothing like the Egypt of Merneith, who is the first queen that she talks about. And so it's really fascinating. This is a really whirlwind tour through ancient Egypt, and I just really, really loved it. Cooney has a book coming out later this year that is about, I think, 6 pharaohs of Egypt, and I cannot wait. I really cannot wait to read this. So this one is a very high recommend for me. This is probably one of my favorite nonfiction reads of the year. I also read First Love and Other Stories by Ivan Turgenev. And yes, I've already read First Love, so I didn't reread that. But I saw this used, so I had to pick it up because I wanted to read more of Ivan Turgenev's short fiction. So I read The Diary of a Superfluous Man, Mumu, Asya, and King Lear of the Steppes. I have not yet read The Song of Triumphant Love, but The Diary of a Superfluous Man was amazing. 5 stars. It was just incredible. Some of these I liked more than others, but all of them have such beautiful writing and they have such beautiful storytelling. I am really excited about Ivan Turgenev. I just really have loved his writing so far in these short pieces, so I'm hoping that that translates over to his novels. I have heard his novels are an entirely different game to his short stories and novellas, so that is something that kind of concerns me because I've just really, really loved his short fiction. But this is a collection that I will definitely rate 5 stars when I finish it. I just am loving my journey with Russian literature. I also read this month The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, and this is a horror book, so it's kind of out of my comfort zone a little bit, but this was so interesting. This was really, really good. This is a horror book that follows 4 Native American men, and something happened when they were younger that essentially comes back to haunt them. And they're kind of trying to, in some cases, divorce themselves from the traditions that they grew up with. And so this is those traditions kind of coming back and haunting them. It is so eerie. There is a lot of it that actually is quite scary to me anyway, but more interesting than the horror stuff, more interesting than the actual plot, was just kind of the social commentary that Stephen Graham Jones wanted to make. It was just really, really fascinating because The Only Good Indians, of course, comes from a quote that he quotes in this book where essentially a Native American chieftain was speaking to a member of the U.S. Army out west in the 1800s. And so they are being introduced and the Native American man says, "I'm a good Indian. You know, you can trust me." And the U.S. Army captain says, "No, the only good Indians are dead Indians." And so that is a quote that you hear quite a bit, particularly in old Western movies, that's really, really horrible and really offensive. And this book delved quite a bit into the tropes of old Westerns because it is set out west. And I just Loved it. There is such an introspective look into cultural identity here, into how these characters related not only to each other, but when they've kind of moved on, when characters move off the reservation, you know, there's a lot of tension around that. And there is a character who is married to a white woman, and he doesn't feel as though he can tell her the stuff that's going on, because how can she understand it? She's white. She's not Native American. And so this was a fascinating book on so many different levels. It was really fun to read, of course. It was really engaging. It was such a thrilling read. But then it was also trying to say something. And I think it was very successful with what it said, because it really makes you analyze things. It is a book that has stuck with me. I have thought about it several times afterwards, but it's not a book that's going to work for everybody. There is a weird choice with the writing here that does make it feel very choppy, because there were several times that I thought I must have missed something, and then I realized that's just the way that the book was written, and it was intended to be like that. I think it made the thriller feel a little bit more chaotic, and so you really felt suspense, you really felt dread because of the way in which it was written. But there are some interesting choices made here in terms of writing that I don't think will work very well for everyone, but it was so good, and it really wasn't truly scary. I would tell you, I'm not a big horror reader. There were just some parts of it that were really quite eerie. This was a massive release last year, and it's been on my TBR ever since, and I'm so glad that I finally got to it. It was really, really good, and I highly recommend it. Last but not least, I read These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan this month, and this is, I'm not sure if it's YA or adult. Some parts of it make me want to say that it was adult, but the way in which it was written makes me want to say it was YA. But this is essentially a fairy romance. This girl's sister is taken by one of the fairy courts, and she gets involved with the Seelie and the Unseelie prince. And so there's a love triangle here, and it's just good. It's just my bread and butter. I really am a sucker for a fae romance. I think of fae books as palate cleansers, because there's something so comforting about the fae to me, and not necessarily the fae in which they are written in this book. This is more kind of a Sarah J. Maas type of fae, but the fae of Holly Black or of Juliet Marillier, that's my comfort read. I love a fae. I love fairies that are going to get you the second that you walk into a circle of mushrooms. That just makes me feel really cozy. They're kind of magical creatures that always make me feel, you know, kind of homey, autumn-like maybe. You know, things that you want to read curled up with a blanket. So it's kind of like comfort food in that way, a comfort read when I know that a book is about fae. And this had that for me, though of course it did have more of the Sarah J. Maas spin on things, so that these fae feel a little bit more like the elves from Lord of the Rings than they do the kind of dark fae that would make a real bargain with you. I really enjoyed this, despite the fact that I knew where it was going. I knew exactly what would happen on page 1, and that was really the fun of it. That's what makes things like this comfort reads to me, I guess, is because I do know based on certain tropes where these books are gonna go. I found this to be a really enjoyable read. If you like fae romance, pick it up. I highly recommend it, because it was a really, really fun and engaging read. Yes, I knew where it was going, but not knowing where a book is going to go is not really where I derive the most enjoyment out of it, if that makes any sense. It's not where I really feel like it makes or breaks whether or not a book is good, if I thought it was predictable. In some cases it is. In a case like this, the fact that it was predictable is really what made it fun. This book never pretended to be anything other than what it was, which was just a fun read. And so this is one that I really enjoyed, and I'm really glad that I read this month. So those are all of the books that I read in July. If you were interested in Greek myth retellings, I do have a video all about those that I read this month. So I read quite a bit in July. I don't think that all of it was particularly memorable, but I am happy with what I read. I do feel like I got a lot done in July, which is really interesting, but that's all thanks to audiobooks. But I would love to know what you read down below. I would love to know if you have read any of these and what your opinions are on them. So I may not see you again for a little while. I do have a couple of videos filmed. One of them is a book haul. I know that you already saw a book haul from me not too long ago, but that was filmed months ago. So one of them is a book haul, so you may see a couple of videos from me here and there, but otherwise I will be going on my break, I think. But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.